We're moving on to our last presentation. If you're looking at the little windows with images, you probably are going to see one person wearing a mask. That's Shruti Gupta, who is at the airport, who had an opportunity to fly back home from Singapore. So we're going to show her pre-recorded video. But if you want to ask her questions, she's available to take them by chat. Maybe audio, we'll see if that works with the face mask. But chat, I think, should be your go-to if you want to address questions to her. And then I hope somebody's got the video out there to play. Yes, okay, Arlene's got it.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me as part of the panel. My paper is titled Gendered Gigs, Understanding the Gig Economy in New Delhi from a Gendered Perspective. The presentation provides an outline of my paper, which aims to understand the impact technologically mediated work has on workers' employment relations and labor outcomes from a gendered perspective. I employ an intersectional approach by incorporating the axes of gender, class, and caste to understand the futures of workers. The paper undertakes an analysis of a leading on-demand services platform in India called Service Help. The platform provides a range of services. In this paper, I focus on two services performed by women: beauty work and makeup. Overall, I aim to bring out the benefits of the interlinking of the economic rights of workers with the social dimensions of development to suggest ways in which more inclusive and fairer policies can be institutionalized to protect the interests of gig workers. The first part of the presentation will provide an overview of the empirical and theoretical arguments used to drive the research and shape the arguments of the paper. This will be followed by the research questions and methodology. The latter half of the presentation will focus on the findings of the research and the recommendations coming out of the analysis of the data and the ongoing discourse. Overall, the paper and the presentation hopes to highlight the contestations that underline technologically mediated work from a developmental perspective. As an entry point in understanding new forms of work through the gig economy, I focus on a few characteristics which are unique to gig work and have a consequential impact on the everyday lived experiences of workers. The foremost is a reclassification of workers as independent partners or entrepreneurs, along with the introduction of a rating and an intricately linked deactivation system as a means of managing employer-employee relations. As a consequence of the reclassification, there has been a withdrawal of labor protections and benefits. Workers in the gig economy do not receive paid time off, sick leaves, pension contributions, and paid maternity leaves. This must be viewed within the larger discourse on labor protection frameworks for informal workers in India. The proportion of labor compensation in national income in India has consistently declined since the 1980s, leading to the concentration of income and wealth in a few hands. Low labor income also affects macroeconomic aggregates like household consumptions and savings, investments, output, and demand, all of which are important ingredients for growth. At an individual level, it makes it impossible for workers to accumulate wealth, invest in education, skill training, housing, or health. In addition, on-demand services workers are required to undertake work in unfamiliar environments of someone else's house, which opens them up to uncertainties and risks which they have little control over. However, gig work through flexible work arrangements allows women to engage in economic activities outside the house while undertaking the primary responsibilities of household labor. This can be significant for attracting more women into the labor force, given the gender division of household labor and patriarchal expectations of domesticity and femininity. With With regards to women's participation in economic activities outside the house, developmental research has constantly reiterated that greater female workforce participation can significantly improve economic development and economic and social well-being for all. However, the of women in the workforce in India has been puzzling and concerning. Participation rates declined to an historical low of 23.3% in 2017-18. Further, the majority of non-farm urban women are concentrated in a narrow spectrum of work, and they continue to remain in unskilled and semi-skilled occupations. The domination of women in these sectors make them vulnerable to exploitation and discrimination, as these occupations have weak safeguards under labor and social protection frameworks. Women also have lower participation in trade unions. The very nature of the gig economy, wherein women perform work within the private domain of the customer's house, restricts the building of group solidarities and dilutes the possibilities of collectivization. Further, women have conditional access to public spaces. In fact, this is something that substantially shaped my fieldwork. Unlike ride-hailing workers, women did not have a public space where they met, such as petrol stations and queues at airports and malls. Many women only went out alone for appointments and not for other personal or professional benefits. Finally, to better understand women's work, but in particular beauty and makeup work, I use body labor as a theoretical entry point. In short, body labor refers to the performance of services on the body and by the body for compensation. Body labor has an overrepresentation of women workers, and its specificities limits increases in productivity, reduction in cost, and possibilities of capitalization. As makeup and beauty work require the co-presence of workers and clients, emotional labor becomes an essential component of service performance. Body labor as a theoretical tool also helps to highlight the gender, class, and caste dynamics associated with touch. This can be reflective of the inequalities of power and privilege between workers and customers, and thus determine labor outcomes. The review of literature on the workings of the gig economy, coupled with the particularities of women's work in India, informed the research questions and objectives. The research objectives aim to understand how the gig economy, as it stands today, can have developmental implications for all players in the economy, be it workers, consumers, and platforms. Thus, it is centered around three main objectives. One, evaluating the lived experiences of workers. Second, studying worker-customer platform interactions and its impact on labor outcomes. And finally, understanding policy trajectories to ensure economic and social development for all stakeholders. I used a semi-structured qualitative analysis of one of India's largest on-demand services providers called Service Help. Beauty work and makeup was chosen to be studied as it is performed exclusively by women for women. Also, the work is performed within the private sphere of the client's house, which highlights a very specific aspect of women's gig work. 20 beauticians and makeup artists were interviewed between June and July 2019 in New Delhi. Initial contact was established through 2 personal contacts, following which snowballing was used. Interviews were conducted either in person or over the phone based on the preference of the participant. Interviews lasted for an average of 45 minutes. The first finding relates to the restructuring of employment relations. I found that an immediate impact of the restructuring of worker-employer relations has been greater flexibility and autonomy for workers, a novelty for semi-skilled and unskilled workers in India. This was found to be the biggest advantage and also the biggest motivator for participants to join the gig economy. As previously mentioned, flexibility allows women participants to engage in household labor, particularly childcare duties. However, participants could not successfully access freelance opportunities prior to the emergence of gig platforms due to their limited social capital. This can be attributed to the unequal social position of workers and customers, with lower class workers servicing a primarily middle and upper class clientele. Further, women's marginalized positionality within the labor market and household also leads to limited formation of and access to social capital. Having said that, gig work did not bridge the gap of economic capital. I found that all but one participant had access to family capital or savings to buy the equipment or acquire the prerequisite diploma to join the platform. Only one of the 20 participants interviewed took the loan service offered by the platform. The restructuring of employment relations, combined with the particularities of body labor, have resulted in income volatility in the short run. Makeup artists are in demand during the Indian wedding season, approximately spread out over 6 months in a year. Similarly, beauticians are in high demand during the weekends. I find this to be particular to workers performing body labor in the gig economy. With no minimum income guaranteed, workers have to grapple with uncertainties in income during off-peak seasons. In addition, the growth strategy of the organization has resulted in income volatility being stretched towards the long term. This has been a consequence of the supply of makeup artists and beauticians outstripping the demand for their services. In non-gig work, these risks and uncertainties are borne by salon owners rather than workers. Uncertainty about the quantum of future income, when tied with diluted employment benefits such as no paid time off, no sick leaves, no assured insurance coverage, and no maternity benefits, makes women workers' status extremely vulnerable. While gig work has diluted several traditional employment relations, it has maintained one important dimension, which is training and upskilling. Service Health provides training for beauticians and upskilling opportunities for makeup artists. I find that participants perceive these as tools for professionalization, which allows for increased earnings, confidence, and negotiation powers. Training by platforms thus provide a clear link between human and economic capital building, which is largely absent for informal workers. The other distinctive feature of the gig economy is the rating system, which has certain immediate impacts on workers' labor processes and outcomes. The rating system exacerbated the socio-economic differences between workers and customers. Class and caste-based notion impact customers' perceptions towards the value and quality of services and those who perform them. Many participants shared that clients treat them as servants. In order to counter these inequalities, to get a good rating, participants undertake unpaid labor and emotional labor. I find that the performance of unpaid labor and emotional labor is unique to body work in the gig economy. Unlike, for example, ride-hailing services, which are monitored through GPS, makeup and beauty services cannot be standardized. This makes service evaluation complicated and ambiguous, and thus often exploited by consumers who wish to receive unpaid labor. Further, the feeling rules of privilege and pampering associated with body work necessitate emotional labor, again made more severe by the need to get a good rating. Ratings have a very real and tangible impact on labor outcomes. Often a bad rating or review can block the worker's profile on the app, effectively cutting them off from their primary income source. There are no standardized mechanisms in place to address worker concerns about unfair ratings and deactivation. Resolving of disputes is arbitrary and difficult to pursue for workers who have low social and economic capital. These problems become more pronounced in the case of women who are doubly disadvantaged due to their limited access to public spaces and limited freedom to navigate it for personal and professional pursuits. The final finding I would like to highlight is the impact of the gig economy on the personal safety of women workers. Beauticians and makeup artists undertake work inside the personal space of another person's home, which immediately impacts their safety. Tasks are allocated to workers with only the name, address, and phone number of the client, along with a small description of the task requirements. This makes it difficult for workers to assess the risks they face. Through interviews, it was ascertained that Service Help has negligible systems in place to mitigate safety hazards. The current system shifts the burden of ensuring safety onto workers. In trainings, workers are told to call the client within 15 minutes of receiving work requests to gauge if the lead is genuine or not. Participants often rely on what they call their sixth sense to assess potential dangers and risks. Some participants rely on male family members to help counter safety risks. They ask husbands, brothers, or fathers to drop and pick them up and to wait outside the client's house till they feel safe. When workers contact platform representatives when faced with a dangerous situation, they're generally asked to cancel the job request. This means that workers have to then pay a cancellation penalty and bear transportation costs. This often restricts women from reporting unsafe conditions and dangerous customers to the platform. Further, risk to personal safety sometimes extends beyond the workspace through continued and prolonged harassment and stalking, for which there are currently no mechanisms in place. As the gig economy matures and stabilizes India, there is a growing need to institutionalize inclusive and fairer policies to protect the economic rights of workers and to meet the social dimensions of development. Given India's ongoing and worsening unemployment crisis, the role of the gig economy in creating job opportunities, particularly for women, cannot be undermined. However, at the same time, job creation cannot be divorced from the provision of meaningful opportunities. To do so, there is a growing need to define the relationship between the platform, workers, and the government, which can be undertaken through a combination of regulatory oversight and self-regulation by platforms themselves. These have the potential to institutionalize income stability, protection of employment relations, and better social protections, all needs articulated by research participants themselves. Further, there is a need to develop more humane and fairer technological interventions to manage work. The rating and automatic deactivation processes need to be rethought given the cultural and social context of Indian societies. A two-way rating system must be institutionalized in an effort to dismantle hierarchies prevalent in the gig economy, and customers with poor ratings and reviews should be held to the same standards as workers by penalizing and blacklisting their profiles. Other measures can be to have an appeal mechanism against deactivation, virtual helplines, and community forums for workers. With the increasing number of women engaged in the gig economy, employers must undertake steps to ensure the provision of a safe working environment. While the Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act is required to protect all women workers from workplace harassment and assaults, informal workers are often left out of its purview. Platforms must be mindful of the power dynamics between the platform, worker, and customer, and must design mechanisms to protect the interests of women filing complaints under the Act. Further, there is a need to build group solidarities to effect change. Unionization and collectivization have historically enabled economic and social development and can thus help push for change for gig workers as well. While the gig economy provides gainful employment opportunities, flexible work arrangements, and opportunities for upskilling and training, most being a novelty for unskilled and semi-skilled workers in India, it is also important to understand the costs and impacts to all stakeholders, and in doing so, evolve thoughtful ways to build future workspaces. Thank you.
All right, so Shruti is available for your questions. I'm sure it will take her just a moment to respond by chat, but if people want to kind of line up a couple questions right off the bat, And then we have, it looks like we've got 15 minutes to take questions for all of the talks in this session, but let's start with a few questions for Shruti. I'll be looking for hands and for questions in chat. Go ahead, Johnny.
Hi, thank you, Shruti. Great work. So you mentioned that, a lot of these workers, get their husbands, fathers, brothers to drop them to work at their clients' homes. So in my experience, a lot of the online beauty workers and makeup service or physiotherapy workers in Bangalore on these online services are migrants, right? They're from Northeast India. And they might have like an added disadvantage. Could you say a little more about the background of these workers? Are they all local to Delhi? Where are they coming from? Just a little more background.
Okay, so I'm gonna try and respond through voice. Can you hear?
You sound good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so this is something that we also kind of thought about while designing the research about status of the domicile status of the workers. And that is something that we found different between Bangalore and Delhi. And we took Bangalore as a particular, as a comparative point to kind of understand, because to understand migrancy as kind of like a entry point into understanding their experiences. And what I found when I kind of interviewed these women was that most of them were from Delhi, or if they were migrants, they migrated as children or kind of like early adulthood. So they have been in Delhi for a considerable period of time. So I guess this is something very specific to Delhi and the participants that I interviewed. But yes, that is something that we kind of thought about to kind of understand migrants and their experiences.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Shruti? And if not, I will just go ahead and open up to any questions for any of the papers. And I mean, I see lots of connections between these papers as well. So if there are questions anyone wants to address to multiple papers in this session, that's great too.
I see Nick Bildwell has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, do you want me to say it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, I was typing. So Shruti, but maybe there's somebody else here. So if we juxtaposition what your recommendations were and what you found with the stuff that I was talking about on Wednesday, I was wondering if there's any evidence anywhere, but particularly around gender and emotional work and care labour and unpaid labour and so on, that shifting the value system, if you like, of platform work can change local values. So what I'm trying to say is emotional and care labour is undervalued in communities anyway. Could this be a lever for change? Is there any evidence that might suggest it is, or what are your opinions about that?
So I agree with you that emotional and kind of care labor by itself is undervalued, and a lot of times is not valued. So even in the gig economies, emotional labor is kind of a given that these participants are supposed to undertake. But something that I found interesting was that because of kind of the mechanical nature of their work, a lot of them prize doing emotional labor. So a lot of the participants actually valued and found that to be kind of enriching part of their job in comparison to them actually performing beauty and makeup work. And so I think that could be a great entry point to understanding how participants themselves, first of all, value emotional and care labor that they undertake, and that and that through maybe engagement with the platform could be a great way to kind of start a conversation about the value of emotional and care labor. And this is also something kind of emphasized on by the platform in the sense of kind of the relationality that they should have with clients. But I don't think that it's something that's valued in terms of skills or kind of monetary values. So I think like that conversation still needs to kind of start. But from the participants' end, I feel, yeah, they do kind of value them performing emotional and care labor.
I see a note from Jonathan. Do you want to say that out loud, or do you want to just leave it in chat?
I could try to say it out loud. I don't know if it'll work,
Okay.
but so it's a really interesting paper, and thanks for sharing that. It's got me wondering if there are ways to think about the gendering of work, and which is some of the stuff that comes up in the analysis, versus the sort of the gendering of the platform itself, the nature of platform work, like from an affordances and constraints perspective. You know, are there and the way those two things intersect, right? Are there ways? You know, there is a growing literature on the platformization of work, even in the global south, but so much of it's from microtasks and ride sharing. And it's really important to have this paper and a few like it, like Raval and Powell from last year, to expand that lens to other contexts and other ways of platforming work. So I'm wondering if you want to kind of expand a little bit on the nature of the platform itself. And are you saying that there's a sort of a gendered component to the platform, or are you situating that mostly in the work or in the intersection of the two?
So, for me, in the case of this paper, I kind of I'm looking at just gendering of the specific work that women take, and these are very women-specific work, which because of just how touch is kind of perceived in case of men touching women, for example, this is something that was traditionally always performed by women within the household, right? So there's just been this shift from the private to the public. And when looking at the as service health as a platform, there hasn't really been a gendering of the platform, because there is a very clear distinction between women's work and men's work. So the other sort of services that are offered, for example, are house repair services, which have traditionally been performed by men in India. And so that continues, and there are no women who kind of perform those tasks. Again, for example, ride hailing platforms in India are traditionally performed by men as drivers. And there has been some sort of push to kind of get women in the platforms. And I think this is also kind of a way for platforms to kind of like diversify and to be more inclusive, but the majority of the work kind of remains to be specific to men. However, there are, for example, the Amazon, the task, the Amazon Turk. I think that is a good way in which we can think about gendering of platforms, because that is a way in which women can be at home while undertaking paid work and also performing kind of gender tasks within the household, like care work within the household. So maybe that is the way of maybe thinking about gendering of platforms, where they can perform work within the private domain of their own house and then combine their care work responsibilities and household labor with kind of paid work outside, like economic paid work. But I think like in the sense of where women are supposed to perform work in outside their house, there hasn't been, or there I don't think there is kind of much scope for gendering of platforms per se.
Are there other questions? Just to jog your memory from what we've been talking about over the last hour. Our first talk was about Facebook groups for women in Pakistan, and the second talk was about women political workers, women election workers in India. Oh, Dorothy, I see you have your hand out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thank you to all the speakers. I was wondering when I was trying to formulate a question that might cut across the different papers. I was just fascinated by the way that they read against particular kind of discourses about women's agency being always curtailed. You know, it's so important that we push back against an idea that especially women in the global south are often portrayed as somehow passive victims to X. And instead we've had basically 3 papers that we're talking about different kinds of agencies, that women had, however limited through circumstances again. So we had, with the Facebook paper, we had an example of really careful, really smart, but really work-intensive curation, and also the emotional labor that was linked to that, potential personal trauma linked to that. In the paper around politics, we were also talking about spaces that were only accessible to women, and in a sense that giving a particular degree of agency to them in the political. And then we had in the gendered gig work, we're kind of also seeing how particular elements of the beauty work, including the emotional labor, might be particularly valued. And I was just struck how that tells different stories about women's agency, but also it intersects very cleverly, potentially problematically, about performing gender identity, potentially performing a particular kind of being a woman in this kind of context, and what that means. And we're not even touching on gender identity questions here. So I was wondering whether any of the speakers wanted to comment a little bit more about the trade-off between agency because of being able to, in a sense, identify as a woman, and the trade-off, what that meant in terms of then having to perform womanhood, however that was construed.
I can attempt a thought on this. It's a complicated question. I think from the context that we're working in, I think that there is this sort of tension between agency and autonomy as it's understood in the West, and agency and autonomy as it's understood in the global South, right? So what you might call curtailing of agency and autonomy might be an option or a choice that's been made in how a woman's living her life in this particular context, right? So I think, and I think that what you just said was so, it was just so on point, because there is certain advantages or certain choices available as a woman in this context, right? Because you are a woman, in certain spaces, there's certain respect that's due to you. And it's almost like a privilege of performing gender. So that certainly exists, right? But I also think that, at least with the group of women that we've engaged with in this, because they're literate and they're not, they're an anomaly. So when we work with most of the women in Lahore or surrounding cities in Pakistan, they're low literate, low income women, right? So this is like sort of a 10% or 15% of the population that's aware of these, and that can have sort of conversations around what it means for them to have agency and what it means for them. And they're very aware of, okay, that this is a choice I've made. And to me, this is having agency and this is being empowered, even though it doesn't look like what I'm being told agency and empowerment looks like, which a lot of the times comes from Western discourse. Does that in any way answer your question?
I think, as you say, it's a complicated space, but thank you very much for that response. Shruti, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so in terms of my research, when I kind of think about agency and the performing of gender, I feel that women kind of do that on 2 levels. So one is the embodied kind of experiences of agency and performing gender. which is kind of the expectation of um, femininity and motherhood that they're expected to do within the private sphere, and how that kind of translates for their economic activities. But there is also this kind of cognitive agency which kind of needs to be incorporated when we think about agency, and how women kind of envision, um, have these imagined futures for themselves, and how they kind of undertake work sometimes in um, kind of in contradiction with what kind of their family would want them to do for better kind of lives for their children. So there is kind of this contestation also between kind of what the embodied agency expectations are out of them, as well as their kind of future imaginings and their cognitive agency, and then how they kind of like intersect to determine their everyday life experiences.
So we've gone right up to the end of our session time. I'm going to close down the session and thank you to our three speakers. These are really interesting talks, and I think they worked very well together as a session. So I'm thrilled to have been asked to chair this particular session. And what's on our schedule next? I didn't check to see what was after the session. Do we have a coffee break?
We have a coffee break, and
okay.
It's been fun. People are being assigned to small discussion groups, so it's a great place to get to know new people. And so we welcome you there, and then we have our final paper session following that. And then we close out the afternoon, or afternoon East Coast time, with a keynote by Carla Morales. We'll see you there.